Hello, everybody. I hope you're doing well. Today, I want to go over the Gerald Ford presidency, a very short presidency, as you saw from your reading and your responses. So let's get to this now. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. And let's get it going. All right, first slide. A little background on Gerald Ford, born in Omaha, Nebraska, 1913. He served in the military, was highly decorated in the military. Now, his background was, in politics at least, was in Congress. He served as a representative in the House of Representatives. He was, at one point, the minority leader, so a very powerful position in the House. Served 25 years there. He was considered a moderate, so while he was on the political spectrum leaning to the right, he wasn't leaning that far. He was, right in the middle. In at least today's, he would probably be viewed as a Democrat, but in the 70s, he was considered a moderate conservative. We'll get to later on in this presentation how that changes as he runs for president in 1976. How did he get to be president? Well, Spiro Agnew, the vice president under Richard Nixon, was pretty corrupt when he was, not only when he was governor of Maryland, but when he was vice president, he was still receiving some benefits of some of the illegal activities he had done while governor. So he was forced to resign, even though he said he would never resign. He was forced to resign, which, according to the 25th Amendment, allowed Richard Nixon to appoint a vice president as long as a majority of Congress approves. Him choosing Gerald Ford was a wise decision because Ford was very popular. He wasn't going to really cause any controversy with his nomination. They vetted him pretty well. In other words, they went through his background, and he was pretty clean cut, and they didn't see any problems. So he went through the confirmation process and was approved. So he became vice president. And then when Nixon had all his dealings with Watergate, which forced him into his resignation, then you had Gerald Ford become president, therefore becoming the first person to ever serve as president without being elected into the executive branch. So, we've had presidents that have been killed and the vice president took over, but the vice president at that time had gone through an election. They were, in the same, chosen by the Electoral College just like the president was, but Gerald Ford was different. He was, some would call him the accidental president. When Nixon resigned, he just kind of stepped right into it. When he took the oath of office, he declared, "Our long national nightmare is over." That's important because we're going to get into the next slide and some of the controversies at the very start of his presidency. First one, this wasn't necessarily largely conservative. It just upset his political party more than anything. He nominated as his vice president Nelson B. Rockefeller, former governor of New York, very wealthy individual, as his vice president. He was considered to be a liberal Republican. I mean, some might call him, if he were President Trump, you might call him a rhino, a Republican in name only. But he definitely was not in the path of the party, the way the party was headed. It was becoming more and more conservative. They were moving more to the right politically. And when you appoint someone like Nelson B. Rockefeller as your vice president, you're really not meeting the needs of your political party, which comes to hurt Gerald Ford in the primary in the 1976 election. Now, why would he do something like this? Well, he was dealing with a Democratic Congress. So if he wants to get any initiatives done, he needs to have someone that can communicate with the Democrats and maybe get them to buy in to some of his policies. So it makes sense why he nominated Rockefeller. The goal is for short-term gain, which would be trying to get your policies through. The long-term gain, which would be, are you making yourself popular within your own party for an upcoming election? That move was not so wise. Now, about 1 month after he became president, he pardoned Nixon for any and all crimes that may have been committed during Watergate. Now, a presidential pardon doesn't have to occur after a trial. It can occur at any point. And Nixon obviously had not had a trial yet. It was very shortly after his resignation, but there was going to be a trial. So, some argue that Gerald Ford was part of a cover-up, and maybe that's how he got to be vice president. He promised Nixon he would pardon him if he resigned. And Gerald Ford stuck to this idea, and he carried this little slip of paper with him in his wallet, and it was from a Supreme Court ruling earlier in the century, and it essentially kind of justified why he did what he did. What would the goal be of any trial? To determine the innocence or guilt of an individual. Now, do you want the presidency to be dragged through a trial? And if Ford's idea was that would not be good for the office of the president. So he offered up the pardon to Nixon. Nixon could have refused it and gone to trial. But when Nixon accepted that pardon, what was he essentially accepting? He was accepting guilt. He was admitting responsibility, admitting that he needed this pardon, he needed this legal forgiveness of a crime. And Ford said, I accomplished with that pardon what a trial would have accomplished to determine someone's innocence or guilt. And in this case, Nixon admitted his guilt by accepting that pardon. So Ford's justification seems reasonable. Now, if you're 30 days out or a month out from Nixon resigning, it looks bad. But it does make sense when you look at it later on. And he got Nixon to admit his guilt. It didn't drag the presidency through a trial and having to deal with all the legal hurdles that would come with that. So it makes sense as you look at it later, but it was not good at that time. Now, a little timeline of the Ford presidency. It was very short, so let's go through this. Issues a full pardon to Nixon on September 8th. Announces a clemency where draft evaders and military deserters could kind of get some of their rights back by, volunteering and doing other services. It's a way to kind of heal some of the wounds of Vietnam. On October 8th, Ford speaks to a joint session of Congress. He calls for a tax hike, which is not popular, especially when you have an upcoming election. When you cut federal spending, that's also not popular because, we all like the government to spend money on us. And he creates this voluntary inflation-fighting organization called Whip Inflation Now. And in the next midterm or off-year elections, the Democrats just really, really take over, and they have a larger majority than they did before. So he's not popular. His policies are not working out well, and you still have the issues of a stagflation from the Nixon administration. Briefly, before I get into some of his foreign policy, there were a couple questions on student busing in Boston. Very controversial subject to force desegregation. That's not necessarily the controversy. It's how do you create school systems that show diversity. And Ford really struggled with the role of the federal government in this. We saw Eisenhower in the Little Rock Nine, where he brought in the military to ensure these 9 African American students could go to school. Ford looked at it more in a conservative way where, that's a state's issue and then let's let the states handle it. So he really didn't want to get involved. You look at that very similar response to New York City's near bankruptcy. I mean, that city could have been bankrupt. And if you talk to anyone that lived or went to New York City in the 70s, it was a very dangerous place. There was crime in the streets. You would not walk down Manhattan like you would today. So he chose to kind of turn his back on New York City and let them fight their way out of it because he thought that was a local matter. Now, into his foreign policy. The Mayaguez incident was an incident that occurred when the Khmer Rouge, this militant group in Cambodia, seized this ship. Ford responded with a rescue mission. The only problem was there was a little bit of maybe jumping the gun because as we were on our way to rescue this crew, they had been released, and we went in. We had some tragedy that occurred, a helicopter crash. There were still 3 Marines that were left on the island, and it's just a really unfortunate event, and it looks bad for our president. Not only is it bad because you had people killed, you had soldiers killed, but it looks bad because it looks like he didn't know what was going on, and he didn't. You kind of combine that with his missteps. He falls coming out of Air Force One. He takes a golf shot and hits someone in the crowd. He just seemed like he was awfully clumsy. And if you looked at that Saturday Night Live skit, they did a very good job of mocking him. And that's not the first president. That's not the last president Saturday Night Live ends up mocking, but they did a really nice job with how they kind of captured what people thought of Gerald Ford. Now, as we continue with the Helsinki Accord of 1975, Ford's looking to try and gain some points here politically with some of his foreign policies. So, this was an attempt to kind of continue that policy of détente that Nixon had. And the U.S. and USSR, the Soviet Union, recognized the boundaries. This is where we're essentially looking at the Soviet Union's boundaries and saying, yeah, we agree. This is your land. We're not going to fight over any of it. This is the area that you control. Now, if you're a conservative like Ronald Reagan, you hate this idea. You hate the fact that you're suddenly recognizing um, the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. So it was not a popular um, agreement that back home, especially with conservatives in his own party. Maybe something that was historic, though, and a good thing was he was the first president to visit Japan. So he was trying really hard to have some success with foreign policy, and it just was not working out. Now we look at the election in 1976. Typically, a president doesn't face a challenge on the primary. It shows weakness, and if you look at President Trump today in the 2020 election, is there a challenger in the Republican Party? No, there's not. The party doesn't want to have a president weakened by someone challenging them in the primary. But in the election of 1976, you've had just that. You had Ronald Reagan, this conservative, really wanting to push the party more to the right, and he challenged Ford in the primary and was very, very successful. Former governor of California, so obviously that plays a role in winning a couple of primaries. Ford eventually captured the primary for the Republicans, but he shifted his platform and his policies to be much more conservative. He dropped Rockefeller as vice president and chose Bob Dole as his running mate. Bob Dole ends up running for president in the 90s against Clinton. So chooses another legislator to run with him. The election in 1976 pitted Gerald Ford versus this relatively young political individual, Jimmy Carter, who was a peanut farmer from Georgia. He was I believe he's a nuclear engineer on a sub for the U.S. military earlier in his life. But his campaign was basically, I'm a Washington outsider. I'm not involved in any of the events of Watergate. I'm not involved with all the corruption. I'm not involved with the events of Vietnam. I'm new. I'm here to kind of pull the country out of this. And he had missteps along the way as well during his campaign. But being from Georgia, he was able to capture those southern states, which hadn't gone to a Democrat since Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act in 1964. So that was significant. And if you look at the map on the screen, it's really an unusual map. I mean, Carter captured a lot of the East, but none of the West. So it is interesting to see how this country was politically in 1976. The Electoral College was relatively close, 297 to 241. I mean, you had a sitting president get defeated. That doesn't happen very often. So the race was close, but we now have a shift. We now have a Democrat in office. And the next part of this course will take us through the Carter administration, and we'll talk about some of the events that are occurring at that time. If you have any questions for me, feel free to send me an email. I would appreciate it if on your assignment you just, mark as done. You've watched this presentation. If you have anything to add, feel free to send me an email or send me a comment. I appreciate all of your hard work, and I hope you all are doing well. This is the last lesson for the week, so enjoy your weekend. Catch up on any work that you need to, and if you're missing something from me, if you have a question as to what I marked on an assignment, please let me know so we can get everything taken care of. All right, good luck, and have a great weekend.